right, folks, welcome to The Curse of Politics. Here with me are Scott Reid, who I think is Canada's foremost political analyst, found on radio, CTV, and most memorably here on The Curse of Politics. And today, Allan Gregg joins us. One of the founders of the polling industry in Canada, one of the most insightful people in my experience in politics, and the author of the best book on leadership campaigns in Canada ever written, Contenders. I don't want to cover up his name. Am I covering up his name? No, Perlin. Who cares?
Hey, George Perlin was my prof at Queen's. Great prof. Looked a little like Lenin, wouldn't you say, Allan? But great prof.
Anyway, it's good to see you, Scott. Allan, thanks for joining us. How's your summer been now that it's over?
It's good. It's good. Summer's always good. Summer's all year long for me.
Well, that's
David,
right. Yeah.
David, you left a few things out of Allan's resume. Right?
What?
Well, he's former co-manager of the Tragically Hip, which I think is a pretty cool thing as music fans.
Yeah,
and
we don't do music on this pod anymore, though.
Not anymore. And correct me if I'm wrong, Allan. I don't know if it's 5 or 6, but I think it's 5 times consecutive. You've won the Greater Toronto Billy Gibbons Lookalike Contest. Isn't that right?
I got a tryout for ZZ Top in 2025. Right. So I'm working on it.
I love this beard you grew a couple years ago. It's more than a couple now. Eh? It's been a while.
At one certain point in your life, you give up on trying to be handsome and you go for wise. That's it. That's the full height of my ambition now. Wise.
David hit that, obviously.
Yeah. I think the true sign of when you've stopped caring is when you let your eyebrows go into that swirly, curly hue thing. When you see people with those crazy eyebrows, you know they've quit entirely. All right, let's get to the CPC leadership race, which winds up this week. Allan, Contenders contained a really interesting and rigorous profile of the composition of the Progressive Conservative Party as it existed in 1983.
Yeah.
How do you think it differs today?
Hugely. I mean, what we found in the research that we did for the 83 convention is that half of the delegates were progressive conservatives in the classic kind of red Tory sense. The other half were outsiders. They just believed that they didn't have a say, they didn't have a voice. And that group, that half back then, is now almost all of the conservative base. Having gone also for a one person, one vote under the guise that this is more democratic than a delegated convention, they've also opened this up to special interest politics. I mean, leadership conventions today in Canada are not dissimilar to primary contests in the United States in gerrymandered districts, where you actually have to appeal to the most peripheral voters in order to actually win. So it's a very, very different party. I think we'll probably get into this later on. But, you know, when I was actively doing campaigns, single biggest voting bloc always was conservative liberal switchers, red Tories, blue liberals. Today, there are no conservative liberal switchers. Conservative ceiling's very, very low, and their floor is very high. They've got a strong core, but very, very little room to grow. In the last election, one of the reasons that Erin O'Toole moved to the center, for example, was when they got their polling out, the number of people who had the Conservatives as their second choice was a grand total of 2% of the electorate. 2% of the electorate. So they looked at that and said, we can't go anywhere. We have to get Liberals and New Democrats to at least consider us as a possibility, because none were. And so this is the dilemma that the Conservatives are always in. They've got, you know, a core base that they can mobilize. It's more likely to turn out because it tends to be a little older, a little bit more motivated because they are outs, but with very, very little room to grow because Liberals and New Democrats show no appeal to them whatsoever.
Scott, you've been, pretty focused on how successful Poilievre's campaign has been and how, it's engaged a lot of people at rallies and, we've been expressing concern about momentum. What do we make of the fact that there's been no bounce in the polls for the Conservatives through this leadership race? I mean, historically, the leadership races generated tremendous surges in support for the party that was having one. They may be ephemeral, as they were in 1984 for Turner, for example, but nonetheless, Turner erased a 15-point deficit and had 10 points at the end of the Liberal leadership campaign.
Kim Campbell in 1993.
Huge.
I mean, the Conservatives were dead
Yeah.
until that leadership campaign. Again, not lasting.
I was working in Chrétien's opposition operation at that time. I'd gone to Ottawa in the summer of 1992. And when Campbell took over the leadership, I can remember sitting in the OLO and Donolo turning to me, and it was like footage of her on the National or something. And she's dancing with people, and you could see like that bounce effect. And he looks at me and he says, "Do you think we're in trouble?" Like that was the thought that was going through our minds, right? And we were wondering, oh God, is this caught fire? And by the way, like, people talk about it well, and then inevitably the inevitable happened. I'm not sure. I mean, Allan, you were much closer to it. Obviously, you were right in the middle of it. I'm not sure it was inevitable, right? She just flamed out because, as it turned out, she was not a mature candidate, right? And in terms of her approach to electoral politics from a leadership position. But the bounce was real. Like that bounce was fucking real, and people were open to shopping their vote elsewhere. I think the most interesting thing about our politics today, and it's reflected in the fact that there's no bounce, is that it's so girded, that it is so locked in, that it's so static, right? So everybody, the two front-running parties are at, give or take, 30 to 32%, right? When you get a bad poll for the Liberals now, it's 27. When you get a good poll, it's 33. And that's kind of the band in which the Conservatives are also operating. So, I think it's a really interesting thought when you combine it with what Allan was saying earlier. To me, politics is pure ceilings and floors now. I mean, that's the whole dynamic if you're doing it. And people are thinking about, well, what matters more? Like, does a high floor matter more than a low ceiling? That's the question that Conservatives around Poilievre are asking themselves right now. And they're saying, you know what? If we can get 32%, and if the Prime Minister's at 32%, the economy's poor, and we can pivot from talking about vaccine mandates and we move into a discussion about you're getting fucked over by an economy that isn't producing for you and a prime minister that isn't concerned about making that economy produce for you, then we can stretch 32 into 34 and we win the election. The challenge for the Conservatives is because of the concentration of their vote, they have to get a bigger number than the Liberals, right? So their 32 isn't the same as the Liberal 32. They've got to get to 34, 35, 36 in order to translate that into seats. But I think right now the interesting debate about politics in some ways is what matters more, a high floor or a high or a low ceiling, and or a high ceiling, I should say.
Well, we're going to get a real test of this with Poilievre, are we not? Because Poilievre is explicitly rejecting the pursuit of swing voters. Like, he's not going to concoct some carbon tax thing like O'Toole did in order to try to persuade 2 or 3 percentage points of people to vote for them instead. They're going to take the 30% floor that Allan said and assume that they'll vote for any Conservative offering, no matter how extreme, and they're going to try to win the election with a surprising surge of young men who don't normally vote in elections coming out to vote in young elections. That's what it looks like to me. Does that have any prospect of success?
I see it a little bit different in that, in fact, I think Conservatives throughout North America have finally realized that their ceiling is too low and that they have to elevate it. And the way they elevate it is to go after blue-collar workers. If you ask people today, in the next 2 to 5 years, do you think you'll be better off, worse off, or the same as you are today? 1/3 say I'm going to be better off, 1/3 say I'm going to be the same, and 1/3 say I'm going to be worse off. You think about that. That's where the polarization in this country is. Not so much in ideology, but in lived experience. So you got 1/3 of the population saying I'm flourishing. You have 1/3 that say I'm treading water, and you got 1/3 that's saying I'm falling behind. Poilievre isn't talking to the 1/3 who's flourishing. This is why we have so little frame of reference to understand him, because that's who we are. He's talking to the 1/3 that say they're falling behind and or treading water. You listen to him when he talks about inflation. And sure, he's talking about firing the governor of the Bank of Canada, but he's also talking about single mothers who have to put water in their milk. He's talking about 35-year-olds who have to stay at home and live with their parents and can't bring a date home as a consequence. He's talking about minors who don't have enough money to send their kids to universities. Doug Ford figured that out. and quite successfully, put in a labor minister who was really sensitive, had 8 unions endorse him. In my entire life, I've never heard of unions endorsing conservatives. And this is where Poilievre is going. He's not stupid. I mean, they looked in the last 2 elections of the 60 most densely populated ridings in the country, they won a grand total of 0. None. Now, they don't have to win Rosedale in downtown Toronto, but they've got to win Etobicoke seats. Forget about Brampton seats and Mississauga seats. They've got to start getting that blue-collar vote in the suburbs. And I think he's keenly aware of that and aimed in a laser beam way at it. One of the other reasons, I think, again, this guy's very, very unusual. We have very little frame of reference to understand him, both because of the precedent, but also because of just his outlook. Is when was the last time he talked to the legacy media? When was the last time he had a press conference? Never. He has no interest in the traditional media. He's going to focus on question period because he's really good at it. He's going to focus on social media.
Not even in the hurly-burly. He won't come on the hurly-burly.
No, not interested. No. He did last week a YouTube video on the Plain Language Act that he was going to bring in. How all bureaucracies, whatever he called it, has to be in plain language. Now, we laugh at this. He said this is a nutty thing. Within 4 days, he had 70,000 views, and every one of the comments were right on. Finally, someone's talking some sense. Finally, someone's doing something that's actually going to make a difference to make government serve us so that we can understand it. So this guy's going to change the dynamic in politics in a huge way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, that Plain Language Act really frosts my strawberry bush. It just drives me crazy, man. It's like the irony of a guy, and I know I'm walking right into the open manhole cover that is Laurentian elite talk. Yeah. But like for
boy, we're
sake,
articulate today, aren't we?
Are we ever? A guy who talks nonstop about let's have the thought police and the language police out of our politics says, and one of my first things I'm going to do is pass a law that says you have to speak in the way in which I say. I agree with you, Allan. I think there's a weird possibility. I have a belief and a fear about Poilievre. My belief, as we talk about, well, is it a durable enough approach to politics and coalition that he can win an election? My belief is that it's very hard for the coalition he's building to get reelected on because it is a protest phenomenon. It is about, it's somewhat circumstantial and situational. You've got to feel disaffected about the economy. You got to feel disaffected about politics and hoovering that up. And I guess my fear is, so my belief is that that's hard to get reelected on. Once you're an incumbent, the ability to sustain that is pretty difficult. But my fear is that you could get elected on it if circumstances line up. If you have an incumbent government that is a little bit deaf to some of those concerns and plays into the weaknesses of those arguments, and if he can fully get his vote out and then squeeze out, as we say, make the pivot Make the pivot away from the people who are mad about vaccine mandates, who I think genuinely represent a fringe portion of the population, to a much larger pool of people who are blue-collar workers, who feel like the way the economy is set up now leaves them behind, feels like they get jobbed, who feels like government exists not to serve their ends but others' ends. I really fear that that there's enough there to get you elected, which is why I think the responsibility, the burden here, falls on the incumbent government to match it and trump it. Because if they just take this attitude of people are going to see this guy for what he is, he's going to burn out, and we don't need to overreact to it. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Hurly-burlyites, our world tour continues. Last couple of weeks, we spent some quality time in South Korea. This week, a whirlwind spin around all G7 countries. We take it on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And in case you've forgotten, this is a tour of international best practices, countries who are using evidence to create policy around how they manage and distribute their spectrum. Spectrum is what makes wireless connectivity work. So how does Canadian policy stack up when it comes to connecting our rural and remote communities? Well, Canada has had a long-standing commitment to a thing called set-asides. Basically, our government sets aside some spectrum at greatly subsidized rates to incentivize regional operators to invest and drive connectivity in rural markets. That's the theory. But here's the thing. There's no evidence to suggest it's working. Like, none. On the average, only 20% of the rural spectrum held by regional carriers has even been deployed, which means entire communities are going without high-speed wireless. And what of our friends in the G7? No other G7 nation used set-asides in their mid-band spectrum allocation. You can throw Australia and South Korea in there too. They didn't use them either. Despite all this, Canada is still considering set-asides for our upcoming millimeter wave auction, just like we considered them for our second of two mid-band spectrum auctions. In that case, the government smartly decided to go with the far more common and successful CAPS system, based on the reams of evidence from international best practices that it's a far more successful competitive measure. Caps are on the table for the millimeter wave auction too. Hurly-burlyites, I've talked about it here before. TELUS believes every rural and remote community should have access to high-speed connectivity, on par with our urban centers. Government social policy says they believe that too. So it's critical that the same evidence-based policy making is applied to get us there. More next week from Germany, France, the UK, and Sweden. So, Allan, give the Liberals some advice here. Give the Liberals some advice. The question is, at the end of 10 years of government, the opposition is the favorite, just based on fatigue. So normally, if an incumbent government wins another term, it's because the alternative was unacceptable to too many people. Of all the things he does, what would make Poilievre unacceptable to some of those voters he's appealing to?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Context is hugely important. I mean, it's not just a question of the choice of the alternatives that are there, but the larger public mood. I mean, one of the most successful campaign slogans ever has been "Time for a change." When you just get that sentiment, when people say, "Enough for these guys," throw the rascals out. Who could be worse? So the default for the Liberals often is to try to make the other guys worse and to run a negative campaign. Both of you have done this very successfully, and Poilievre. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he says that is nutty is taken out of context, but it's nutty on its surface about cryptocurrency and Bank of Canada and as Scott says, to the vaccine mandates, which are only opposed by a small fringe. But if I was advising the Liberals, I would give them the same advice I'd give any progressive in North America, is that you have to get away from identity politics and shift back to class politics. And those who are dealing with injustices as a consequence of social inequity will be attracted to that. And those who aren't, but feel that they're being left behind, will say, these guys are at least speaking for me. I mean, in the work that I've done, is that choice, whether it's consumer choice or public policy choice, or especially political choice, is often rooted in emotion. But it's based on surprisingly rational criteria. So subconsciously, people, and that criteria is self-interest and self-image. So people say subconsciously, are they for me, and are they like me? Self-interest and self-identity. That's what Poilievre, I think, is trying to do. He's trying to say, I'm more likely, and that the problem with the other guys isn't that they don't care. They care about the wrong stuff. And that's what inflames the base. So going back to what I was saying also about the largest bloc being liberal conservative switchers, the biggest bloc today is liberal New Democrat switchers. And this makes it a little tougher to do while the Liberals are in a coalition, functional coalition with the New Democrats. There's virtually not a New Democrat in Canada who wouldn't vote Liberal under certain circumstances. And there virtually isn't a Liberal who wouldn't vote New Democrat under certain circumstances. So I think if they could really, again, demonstrate that they were for these people who were falling behind, they have a good chance of not simply stopping Poilievre's effectiveness, but also eroding the NDP base even further.
So, Scott, Poilievre comes out and he's got a laser focus on working class economics and his prescriptions may not be what economists think will work, but he's at a minimum asking the right questions, as Allan says, and talking about the right things, right? How much pressure does this put on the NDP and their coalition with the Liberals? How long can they sit back, silent on these issues because they're supporting the government, while Poilievre eats their lunch with working class people?
I think it's a really tricky balance, and I think the longer it goes on, the more insufferable the relationship happens, because it's not even just that. The dynamic, I think, is even more challenging for the NDP, because they're also looking across the table at a partner who they know is at some point looking at them like their lunch. Like when Trudeau looks across the aisle at the New Democratic MPs, he says, you are the people I am going to consume in this next election and must consume in this next election because of this high ceiling issue high floor we're talking about, this high floor issue we're talking about. It means that the Liberals have no choice but to get all of their vote and then steal, in the last 2 to 3 weeks of an election campaign, the NDP vote and consolidate it. And so I think the NDP regard this coalition deal, and they have to say to themselves, how do we move through this deal to fortify against that inevitable dynamic and to leave ourselves in a position? But I think, NDP voters vote with emotion, Liberal voters vote with emotion, not just Conservatives. And eventually in that, people are going to look on that side of the spectrum, and they're going to look at Poilievre and they're going to say, I'm scared that he's the scariest thing in the room. And I think that's the advantage that Trudeau has, but it's so transparent that that's a dynamic. I think it puts real pressure on that coalition.
But the NDP are threatened from both sides. Say for the obvious side, Liberals, because the Liberal NDP vote is so porous. But you look at the last Ontario provincial election, those 7 or 8 seats that the Conservatives picked up, they're virtually all New Democrats. In Windsor and Timmins, ridings again, that historically Conservatives had no chance at all, because again, Doug Ford was smart enough to understand that blue-collar worker has got an affinity to the Conservatives if properly positioned.
And Poilievre is going to go after those lunch buckets. Yeah. He's going to sound a little bit more like Monty McNaughton, than he sounds like convoy guy.
I think so.
I don't think this deal lasted 2025. Do you think it lasted 2025?
I don't think so either.
You really have to wonder what's in it for the NDP. I mean, we've seen these kind of deals historically, and they never work out for the little guy in the bargain ever.
No, they've got to start carving some territory for themselves well before the next election. Yeah. Let's go back just one thing to the Conservatives, because I had Jean Charest on the Herle Burley, and I really liked him, and I thought he was a good guy and a smart guy, and he'd obviously be the person I would be voting for if I was a Conservative. But he's not going to win, and he stopped talking like he's going to win, and it really looks like he stopped trying to win a long time ago. But he hasn't dropped out, and he's going to go and give a speech. And what's his game?
It's going to be very, very tough for him. He's always had a high regard for himself. I mean, ever since he entered politics. So the notion that he's getting, thumped by a little pencil neck geek is going to be very, very hard on him. Going back also to something I said before, is that there's very, very little room left for red Tories. Forget about it in the Conservative Party, anywhere. And similar to blue Liberals, you don't see many anymore. And he clearly is in the red Tory camp. I mean, there has been talk and speculation that he would start his own party. I doubt that. I mean, at 63 years of age, running for the leadership is a vanity project in its own right. My guess is that he'll go back to on the boards that he resigned from to run for this leadership. Cash in.
I think a really interesting what if, as we are 5 days out, is what if he chooses to use his opportunity to speak at that convention to deliver a barn burner of a lecture, to deliver a caution and say, guys...
In the speech he has not yet delivered once in this campaign that was supposed to be about the soul of the Conservative Party?
Exactly. And so what I was going to say is I don't think he will. I think he will, we brought people together and we're going to keep working and yada, yada, and all that kind of shit. And it will be, it will leave no chemical trace, the speech. But he could choose to speak for that minority, that silent minority. Literally, I'm using charged phrases here, but he could use the opportunity to say, guys, we got the balance wrong. We're tilting the fucking pinball table here, and we better be very careful. I just don't think he'll do that. Can I just add one small thing before, because this is the last time we're going to talk before the Conservative leadership when we know what Poilievre will get picked. You know, this ability to move his message without pivoting away from the hard edge, like, it's just not that hard. And people keep talking about how Poilievre is going to be forced to moderate and he's going to be forced. It's exactly as Allan says. He just moves into the lunch bucket working class sphere. And I don't think it's very hard to make that transition without compromising anything that his candidacy has been, without having to say that he deluded himself in any way, that he didn't have to make a sort of vault face in the style of Aaron O'Toole. And I got to tell you, man, like, I grew up in rural Ontario, where, like, we were working hard to make working class, in our household, with just me and my mom. And there are things that Poilievre says that makes me nod my head up and down. And there are things the government says that makes me shake my head in frustration. And I am as dedicated a liberal partisan as you can find. And if that's happening, think about how the 26-year-old guy that, isn't really sure where he's at and how he's going to make his next paycheck. Like, I just think I keep having this sort of patronizing feedback from a bunch of liberals that we are not taking this guy lightly, but you are being an alarmist, and I'm not being an alarmist. Like there's part of my hand that trembles over the ballot thinking, fuck, maybe I got a market for this guy. Like, his message is potent, and the ingredients of our society and economy right now, conspire to make it even more potent. And I really don't see a serious. I'm hoping that this cabinet retreat is the de facto equivalent of for the Liberals is a de facto equivalent of a throne speech, of a major cabinet shuffle, of a reshuffling of the deck and a resetting of the agenda, and a recognition by the party saying, and the incumbent government saying, all right, we got to refocus like a laser beam on bread and butter economics. And we've got to have a high and low strategy on this son of a bitch who's leading the Conservatives now, because we have to be not just respectful of this guy, we got to be flat out afraid of this guy. I hope that's what this cabinet retreat is about.
The way I feel about him is that when he talks about the freedom stuff, I think he's marginal, and I think he appeals to a marginal group of people. When he's on the economics, he's the only person in politics talking about the things that people are caring about right now. And it doesn't matter that his prescriptions aren't right. I mean, like, I think back to Trump-Hillary, and I'm not comparing Poilievre to Trump in this regard. But, Trump said a bunch of crazy shit, but he was talking about the things that Americans were concerned about: illegal immigration, trade deals with China that were preventing you from getting ahead. He had diagnoses that rang truer to people than Hillary's assessment of the economy and American society in 2016 did. Now, you see the same thing with Poilievre potentially if the government and the NDP remain really, I think, off in the netherworld in terms of what people are talking about in the country.
One difference, though, in drawing the parallels, I mean, you think about it, Canada is probably the only country in the world where conservatives refuse to open up the abortion, gay marriage, capital punishment, and immigration issues. So he doesn't have the same kind of territory to deal with as a Trump would or a right winger so he's got to be much more deft. He does have the advantage, being in opposition, is he doesn't have to really offer prescriptions. He just has to define the problems in a way that are eminently relatable to that left behind voter. And he's quite effective at it. Whether social media, and I know this sounds like heresy or like an old nostalgic fart talking here, but I don't know whether social media unto itself is sufficiently persuasive and pervasive enough to actually carry that message if he chooses to ignore the legacy media entirely. I mean, the research that's out there still shows that the average voter is still getting, their news through newspapers and television.
Yeah, but even if he doesn't cater to them, they'll still cover him.
Well, that's probably true. I mean, one of the geniuses of Harper's government is they put, video ads out that they never paid for and never ran anywhere, and the news media covered them all, so they got their message out for free without having to deal directly with the media.
Well, I think it's even better than that. The advantage you have if you're a conservative right now is that you can use social media to connect in a visceral way with your electorate, in a direct way with your electorate. And you can use legacy media to reliably report your assertions. Like, because that's what legacy media does now. And this is our friend Bill Fox, chronicled this in his book brilliantly, right? Which is what the right have figured out is that the rules of legacy media dictate that they have to say, today Allan Gregg said blah, which parenthetically is bullshit, but we won't say that on air. And David Herle said blue. And that's good enough. Like, I mean, if I'm already connecting and communicating everything that I represent in terms of values to my voter base, and I can rely on legacy media to just repeat my assertions without a proper proportionate context and check on them, hey man, I'm winning.
So our sponsor CN has a plan. The railway published it just a few weeks ago in accordance with Canadian law. It's a fairly complex plan, runs about 43 pages. It's stuffed with forecasts and statistics and analysis of shipping flows and supply chains. But basically, it says this. Western Canada's grain crop is returning to normal levels after last year's drought. And thanks to the billions of dollars CN has spent in recent years expanding and refurbishing its fleet of locomotives and hopper cars, upgrading tracks and bridges and crossings, recruiting new railroaders, the railway is ready and able to move all that grain to market. That obviously will be a comfort to Canada's grain farmers and shippers. To say they had a bad time of it last year is to understate matters. A freakish confluence of extreme weather, the pandemic, and a series of natural catastrophes piled on top of the drought, disrupting the supply chain and triggering costly delays. CN's grain plan matters. Rail is far more efficient and powerful than any other form of freight transportation. 1 ton of cargo moves 4 times farther by train than by truck on the same amount of fuel. 1 300-container train replaces 300 trucks. Grain is crucial to our economy, and railways are crucial to grain. CN takes its responsibility to grain farmers and shippers very seriously indeed. CN is committed to helping power Canadian agriculture, and that means getting grain to market. This year, CN reckons it will move about 27 million tons from the prairies to customers in Canada and the US and to seaports for shipment overseas. If the crop turns out to be bigger than that, CN will be ready. And it will happen smoothly if all the other links in the supply chain communicate and work in harmony. It's time to get to work. All right, hey, moving on. We have a section of this show called Clippings. And our clipping today comes from the Canadian Press, although I found it on the CBC website, but it's a Canadian Press story. And it's out of Manitoba, and it's about a dispute between the Prime Minister and the Premier of Manitoba. And it says, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused some politicians Thursday of being dishonest about the effects of the federal government's carbon tax. What the Premier and others across the country don't seem to be honest about with Canadians is in places like Manitoba, where the federal price on pollution applies, average families get more money back from the price on pollution than the extra price on pollution costs them, Trudeau said in Winnipeg. The Premier said, Manitobans need that money now. So rather than taking the money away from them and going through rebates and all this, just leave the money with them. Is the carbon tax, with Poilievre being the leader of the federal Conservatives, is the carbon tax on the ballot in the next election? Is that an election issue?
Sure
Are
it is.
people going to vote on this basis?
But I don't think in an overt way. I think, for example, the Conservatives' opposition to carbon taxation in the past has hurt them terribly because the signal it sends is we don't care about the environment. And we're in a situation now where the environment, there's no more debate around the ends. We have to do something to fix the environment, and specifically on climate change. There's no debate around it's means. And if you eliminate the only means that is part of the debate right now, i.e. a carbon tax, then you're setting yourself up as someone who doesn't believe in the end goal. And that hurts Conservatives terribly. That said, as a witness to the story that you're talking about right now, is that the carbon tax is really, really easy to misconstrue. It's a tax. Who wants a tax? It's bad. The notion that there's a rebate back at the other end, even that seems foolish. Why you take my money and then give it back to me? So the effectiveness of carbon taxation is almost absolutely correlated to support or the perceived effectiveness, if it actually makes a difference. And many Canadians believe that it doesn't. So it's a trap for both parties. I think it's a trap for the Liberals to the extent that it's a tax that a lot of people don't understand. And it's a trap for the Conservatives that if they oppose it, it sends the signal that they don't care about the environment, which again, today is political death.
But Allan, hasn't Biden given them a huge favor? I mean, if Biden had brought in if there was a carbon tax in the United States, the debate would largely be over. But Biden has now, after this Inflation Reduction Act, a highly acclaimed action plan for climate change, but does not include a carbon tax.
Mm-hmm.
How are the Liberals going to say that you need to have a carbon tax to have a credible climate plan?
Because right now that's virtually the only tool that's known. I agree with there's lots of other things they should be doing and could be doing. But again, you listen, going back to our friend Mr. Poilievre, is that he goes after the Conservatives, not necessarily the Liberals, not that they're doing things in the environmental space, but they aren't doing things in the environmental space. They've set up an infrastructure bank that spends no money. He said just gives their executives a whole bunch. They've got a net zero accelerator fund that has done nothing. Absolutely nothing. So there's lots of very precise things the Liberals could be doing in addition to the carbon tax, because the fact of the matter is that we know, and again, sometimes it doesn't matter in politics, but we know that it is a very effective policy tool in terms of reducing pollution and reducing consumption. But I think if they could be doing more with the business community, if they could be demonstrating, because I mean, in my private sector work, there's no question the business community have crossed the Rubicon on this. The oil and gas sector, the fuel sector, the cement sector know that they have to move to a carbon emission plan, and that they know that their investors are going to hightail on them if they don't. So they could be doing a lot to demonstrate progress with private sector partners and demonstrate that and show that the entire weight of solving a problem the consumer cares about isn't simply on the consumer.
Right, but I mean, I assume, Scott, that when Poilievre talks about gatekeepers, that one of the people he's talking about are the environmental regulatory bodies in Canada and laws in Canada that prevent development or restrict development or delay development of resource projects. And I mean, it feels to me like he really wants to emphasize that he's going to let that dynamism go rather than control it with gatekeepers and regulators.
Yeah, look, I think the carbon tax, that balance of risk is that the balance of risk is shifting against the Liberals on it. And that's not an argument to abandon the policy position, but I think they're going to have to radically rethink how they communicate it and the way they brandish it. And so, yes, they'll always want to say, Pierre Poilievre isn't serious about climate, and hope that there's enough legacy attachment to that notion that Conservatives have not been serious on climate, that they can, pump some value out of that. But I think they've got to stop. They've got to resist the temptation to say, and the litmus test of whether or not you have a sincere climate plan is whether or not you have a carbon tax and whether or not you're making it painful on people and extracting something, because that's the only thing that's going to alter behavior and yada, 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 and change the dynamic. I think they've got to abandon all that in a context where people are feeling a cost of living crunch. It's just too vulnerable. And all Poilievre needs to do is to say, I'm going to reference Joe Biden, as you mentioned, David, and say, and here are the 5 other things I'm going to do. And then you get an argument of, those 5 things aren't really sufficient. They're not adequate. And people are like, I don't know, man. I can't distinguish between these things.
That's 100% right. Listen, I mean, I take Allan's point. I don't think that most people will vote for a party that they don't think believes that climate change is happening or that they're not serious about climate change. But what constitutes being serious about climate change is not something that would warm the cockles of a climate scientist's heart. Just like people want a government that takes the deficit seriously, but will accept a 10-year path back to balance as reasonable, right? If I say to people, I've got a climate change plan that doesn't cost you any money, people are going to say, that sounds great.
But I think, though, the Liberals have one more card they can play in this. If they're willing to intellectually make the shift, strategically make the shift off to saying, we need to persuade people that it's a good thing to swallow this carbon tax medicine, if they can shift off of that and resist that impulse and that instinct to tell people that they're right, then they can move to, first of all, this tells you that the conservatives aren't serious about climate and everything they say is just a hall of mirrors. The second thing, though, is our climate plan is an instrument that is giving you a rebate. Our household is getting this. So instead of arguing with the premier of Manitoba that, you're being dishonest about what people get, just blow past that, for Christ's sake, and just say, you know what, you're all getting $660 at a time when people are desperate for relief, and then force the conservatives to say, well, the only reason you're getting that is because first you're extracting it from us and then you're recycling it back through programs. But look, right? They're not serious about climate. We are taking action on climate. And not only that, our climate plan is delivering genuine signed check relief to you at a time when you need that relief. And people will be, Andrew Coyne will write a column saying this is fucking bullshit and all that kind of stuff. But if they don't play on that territory and they just leave themselves open to, well, fundamentally, this carbon tax is a purist desire to show that we're serious about climate and a deaf ear to the cost of living concerns people have, well, then you're getting the worst of all possible worlds. And the hill that Poilievre has to climb in order to say that he's serious, as you mentioned, David, about climate is not very high. I think he can get away with going, you know what, I got a 4-point plan that's going to do this. We're going to ask big business to do more. We're going to work with ingenuity. We're going to tap more on renewables. The Liberals have fucked up a couple things. Here's one bullshit example that I'm going to suggest is illustrative of entire universal experience. And boom, he's off to the races. They got to be better on this. The Liberals have got to be better on this. I hope to Christ they talk about that at this retreat, rather than say, no, we're going to try to persuade everybody that we're the only ones that get it on climate, and that, if it's not extracting real pain from you, then it's not good enough.
Ellen, any last thoughts on this before we move on?
It's a very interesting issue, because I say we've known that the environment has been on the public opinion agenda and political agenda for a long time. Consumers' attitudes are very scattered on it, shall we say. While I say that there's no debate anymore around the ends, it's all around the means. I don't know whether the Conservatives, goes back to what we're talking about in terms of the manner in which their leaders are elected, have the wherewithal to do the four things that Scott is talking about, to seriously offer alternative policies that are aimed at climate change that don't include a carbon tax. I think their instincts would be just to ignore it and to focus on affordability and all kinds of other things that they focus on right now. In which instance, I think that is a vulnerability that can be exploited by the Liberals in an election.
Okay. Hey, there's a Quebec election going on right now, you guys. It looks like Legault is going to win a massive majority. And the two historic parties of Quebec are going to be crushed badly. The Liberals down to a purely Anglophone or Allophone base of ridings, and the PQ maybe to nothing. Super fascinating election. I don't know that any of us are particularly expert on it, but one of the things I think about is, being from Western Canada, I'm hearing all this rhetoric out of the Western premiers about greater autonomy, whether it's Danielle Smith's Sovereignty Act or Scott Moe's rhetoric and all this stuff. And we know that Legault's pursuing a policy of autonomy over time. And I assume, and he's pushing and pushing, and I assume that this renewed massive mandate's going to have him pushing the envelope even further. The Western folks have adjusted their rhetoric from the West wants in the 80s. And now they talk about all we want is what Quebec has. Like, just give us the same powers over our province that Quebec has. Makes a lot of sense to people who live in those provinces when they hear that. Are we headed toward more constitutional shit in this country?
I don't know if in a formal way of actually opening up the Constitution, but I don't think there's any question at all that you're going to see some huge tensions around either should Canada be a more decentralized federation or a more centralized federation, and it will pit the federal Liberals against all of the provinces. You're right. I mean, we've had, so-called asymmetrical.
And so ironically, a Trudeau. Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely.
So ironically, a Trudeau.
Yeah, it really is deja vu all over again. But we've had asymmetrical federalism for a long time. I remember when your guy, Paul Martin, brought in the Health Act in 2005 that basically cut cut out a completely different program and set of rules for Quebec than the rest of the country. And it's interesting, David, that you make the link between Quebec and Western Canada, especially the prairies, because that's where the unholy alliance is most likely to come. And it will be unified and very, very vocal. In a perverse way, Justin Trudeau's perhaps only ally in this is going to be Doug Ford. Playing the role of Bill Davis, who always.
Oh my God, have we gone off Broadway or what?
No kidding, eh? If he comes to a news conference with a pipe, I swear to God, I'm going to lose my mind. Both of you guys are pollsters. Both of you guys have lived your whole lives working public opinion. Isn't the truth an uncomfortable fact for those who are in government and might be subject, those who are in federal power and are subject to this argument coming from the Western premiers? And the fact is, and the reason we were able to do the health accord with an asymmetrical deal in 2004 is that not just the Laurentian elites, but also the public in this country think autonomy for Quebec is okay. Frankly, there's kind of an implicit, not explicitly stated, but waterline sort of level view of what the fuck, they are different, so they have to do it different, then that's fine. And compared to the disruption of actually leaving the Federation and all that's I'll live with it. But they're not okay with autonomy when it comes to the English-speaking provinces. It doesn't make sense to people, and it does disturb people's sense of federalism. And I think the tricky thing for the Prime Minister, and you guys note the irony of a Trudeau, I would say that it underlines why the Prime Minister has to remain in place for this next election, because you got to shuffle. There's no way to directly run up to this. I think in English Canada, you're going to have to say, hang on, there's an idea about the Federation here. There's an idea that we are stronger together than apart. There's an idea about us operating communally. There are disadvantages to pulling on all these threads to the well-being of the sweater that has a maple leaf on the front of it. You start talking about running your own pension plan, it's going to be weaker than the federal pension plan. It's going to be weaker than the national pension plan, right? So I think the Prime Minister is going to have to dance on this. They're going to have to make one case in English Canada, even though it's going to be contradicted by what's occurring in Quebec. And if you have an English language Prime Minister not from Quebec, they're going to feel that pressure even more intensely. They're going to have less of a natural pull with voters in Quebec come the next election. And it's going to be even more awkward and more difficult for them to pull off that shuffle, because you're going to have to play it as a shuffle. And there's no way around it.
All right. Rule number one, when you're doing a podcast, turn off your telephone. The Canadians do have more affinity for the provincial government than the federal government. That said, they also believe in a Canadian way. So the federal government always has terrain to work on in that regard.
But when Scott said, Scott, people don't think about the differences that Quebec has, and you can say they support them. I don't really think that. I think they ignore them. But when they're confronted with them, they don't like them. They would prefer that Quebec was a province like all the others. Most English Canadians.
That's where I was going. That's the other thing that is the Canadian way, is fairness. So the notion that one province is getting one thing and another is not. And again, as a prairie boy, you know this very, very much. I mean, this is what really sparked a lot of the traditional Western alienation, was the notion that Quebec was getting things that aren't. That's why I think the tension is going to be greater right now, because you have the prospect of an actual, as I say, an unholy alliance between the prairies and Quebec, pulling on the oars at exactly the same time for a much more decentralized Canada.
But whether people are just indifferent until presented with it, or whether they're more okay with Quebec being different, ultimately, it still means the same thing. That the Prime Minister of the country is going to have to sail awkwardly between a sandbar and rocks. That's just, and it's going to take a little skill, and you're going to have to tack into the wind, and you're going to have to be fundamentally contradictory at some points. You're going to have to You're going to have to reject some precedents that a Western premier will make based on the example of Quebec, on the hope that you can play the Canada card in English Canada and people will agree with that, more than they'll be consumed by the sense of unfairness of, the strict legal differences that exist between this deal and that deal for Quebec and elsewhere. And I just, there's no, you can't confront this issue in full-fledged terms because the contradiction will blow you up, and you just got to kind of shuffle through it, I think, which is the awkward truth. Like when we were doing a healthcare deal for Quebec, our argument basically was, well, fuck, yeah. Like if the alternative is that there's no health deal at all because we can't come to a common denominator agreement between all of us. If you say, voter, that you desperately want to see these new funds prioritized around critical things like hip surgeries and knee surgeries and shorter wait times, and Quebec says no to that, then we either cut a distinct deal with Quebec or we paralyze ourselves and do nothing. And so you shrug your shoulders and say, like we've said for over 100 years, we'll muddle through.
Yeah, but you're telling Alberta and Saskatchewan, those places, that there's something less than Quebec, that they have some, and it just as a matter of principle, it's going to be difficult for people there to accept if it's thrown in their faces. I mean, normally we have a political process, to your point about Quebec, that doesn't inflame these issues. Normally we have a political process in Canada that knows where the stove is and what you don't touch, and people don't touch it. But if people start touching it, there's not as much consensus in this country as you think there is.
And that's my point. That's why don't start pulling on this thread.
It's interesting also that Scott not only hearkened back to the health deal you guys did, but health is an issue today, because there's no question we've seen a massive deterioration in assessment of the quality of care that Canadians have, in performance of governments in this area, so that the demand for action on this issue is ironically much greater post-pandemic than it was even during the pandemic. And it would not surprise me at all if this push for more decentralization, really crystallized in a very meaningful way around the health transfer and healthcare, and provinces pushing back, saying, you not only have to transfer more to the provinces to cover healthcare, but you cannot tie those transfers to your priorities. They have to be our priorities.
An even higher bar, I think, Allan. It will be, don't tie any of the funding, no conditions, no priorities. But in addition to that, agree to not enforce the Canada Health Act because we wish to experiment outside of the margins. And I think that's when the argument's going to get where it's going to get a little hairy.
Yeah. Hey, so quickly, there's a cabinet retreat this week for the federal Trudeau Liberals out in Vancouver, meeting for a couple of days to discuss their agenda. I've never been to one of these things. Scott, have you been to one of these things? What happens?
I've been to a few. I've been to a few federal ones. I've been to at least a couple provincial ones. They're interesting exercises because you usually gather in some other place. In this case, they're going. They're going out west. They're going to Vancouver, the federal government, and you bring everybody together, and it's a little bit like going to camp. And you lock people up, and you make them work hard during the day. And certain ministers have to give presentations. You bring in ministers, you bring in deputies, you give longer presentations, you talk at a longer piece, not just through do we rubber stamp these appointments, all that stuff, but then you have some strategic discussions. This is by standards usual a long cabinet retreat. It's going to last for 3 days. And I think they're really productive things because often the nature of the government is that cabinet is something you try to whistle through as fast as possible, make it very transactional. My hope is that Trudeau is going to use this to really try to reset the agenda and the political focus. We'll see, both on the economy and on how he approaches the politics of confronting Poilievre. But, I love cabinet retreats. My favorite cabinet retreat story is one time we were in Ontario. We did a cabinet retreat in the Muskoka area. And I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go for a run. And Reg Elcock, minister from Manitoba, God bless his soul, he's no longer with us. But Reg Elcock had decided that he was going to pursue a program of fitness. Reg was about 6'4", 6'5", weighed I don't know how much. He was bigger than a bear, and but he didn't.
I still bet you had trouble keeping up with him.
Well, he didn't have gym stuff. Right, he was so new to this cause that he's sauntering down the hallway, right, and he's kind of Daisy Duke style, got jean shorts on that I think were like
no.
I'm not kidding. I'm shit you not. That's true. He was wearing jean shorts and a belt, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna hit the gym," and I was like, "Oh my god!" And I'm like, one of the downsides of these cabinet retreats are you do get to see a side of people that you don't always see, and maybe that isn't necessarily a good thing.
Is it normal that the cabinet would set the political direction of the government, or is that set by the PMO and the campaign apparatus?
Well, it ought to be all that, but I think it would be weird to not have the cabinet discuss it. And the problem, I think, in a lot of times is that my feeling is that both because so much has become centralized in PMOs, of which I was a part, and because the professionalization of politics means that campaign operations are permanent and they exist as independent institutions almost for parties and governments, that you don't get as much political discussion at the cabinet table. And I think at least sort of saying to people, now listen, you're all going to have some political responsibilities, right? We're going to have to think about what's the unified field theory of how we're going to approach PolyF. What are we looking for? Is it X or is it Y, right? I think those are good things. I think those are good discussions to have with cabinet. You want to get people's input, but you also want to make certain you establish a program and a prescription. So I'm not sure everybody's on the same page, and I'm not sure everybody has the same assumptions.
I think the other thing that happens at these retreats is it's the opportunity for the center, for the PMO, to get a better look at the talent that's around the table and to assess what role, if any, they can play in those more political matters. I mean, there's no question that once writs are issued, cabinet abdicates its responsibility for any political strategy at all. It falls exclusively to the center and to the campaign apparatus. But in the meantime, they've got to carry the prime minister's water until those writs are issued. So this is a good opportunity for that evaluation to take place.
Cool. All right. We are at the end of our hour, which means it's time for our Hey Yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Scott, show Allan how it's done. Give us a Hey You.
Well, I may not be giving you a good example, Allan, because mine is an odd Hey You this week. It's kind of a historic and personal one. My Hey You is to the David Peterson government, because it was on this day, September 6th, that we recorded in 1990, is that right? 32 years ago? 32 years ago today, that David Peterson lost a majority. Called the early election, right? Went to the people, right? Into the teeth of a recession on the heels of Meach's failure, and his seemingly unbeatable majority government got thrashed at the polls, and Bob Rae became premier. And the reason I say I use this the Hey You, it is impossible to overstate what an influence that event had on me. I was a summer student. I went in the late 80s up to Toronto to work at Queen's Park, work for the Peterson government. He had the red tie. It was a trendy urban government. It was super cool, very popular. And I was like bedazzled. And I'm like, fuck, man, this is what I want to do for a living. This is my life. I love this. And I watched all these people who had these jobs. People were making like $85,000 a year working as a political assistant. I'm like, God, this is great. And then, they're like, okay, so halfway through the summer, it's like, you're no longer going to be working for a minister. You're going to go and run Hugh O'Neill's campaign in Quinte, which is my home stomping ground, Prince Edward County, Prince Edward Hastings. And then we got thrashed. Huey actually won the election because he was the most incredible constituency politician you'll ever meet. But government gets thrashed. And I'm watching all these people that I've been watching for these past couple summers in this incredible, invulnerable, cool, trendy government. And all of a sudden, these people were jobless. And all the people that had the ability to pack like a church basement for a nomination meeting found that they no longer could get an $85,000 a year job. And I remember thinking to myself, fuck, there's a lesson in this. I better go try to find some transferable skills. And that was literally, it was 32 years ago today where I said, I'm out of the organization political business, and I'm into the communications political business, because when we're out of power, I can at least try to get someone to pay me to write a speech.
The other lesson, that was the election about nothing, that Mr. Trudeau didn't know anything about in 2021, is, one of the oldest maxims in politics is find an issue and make it your issue. Do not call an election if you have no issues. And that's what Mr. Peterson did in 1990.
100%. All right, we'll skip the hey you from Allan unless he comes up with one in the next minute. My hey you goes out to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Climate Change, whoever it has to be. Shut down this fucking fertilizer discussion in the prairies. For God's sake, this is the last thing that we need with this going on, is for this to take root, that the government's against agriculture and is trying to restrict agriculture. This thing is taking off in the prairies, and it's just got to get shut down. It's completely unhelpful to the Federation right now. That's our show for this week. I want to thank Allan Gregg for joining us. It is always a privilege to talk politics with Allan Gregg. And I'd like to thank Scott Reid for joining us, because it's always a privilege to talk politics with Scott Reid. So, our sponsor, our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who listened or watched, thanks a lot. And we'll see you next week with more Curse of Politics. Till then, take care of yourselves.
Take care, be well.